got interested in writing their story when I was researching my first book, Impossible Subjects, which is about the history of illegal immigration. I was in the Labor Department archives, at the National Archives in College Park. And it was one of those things where you come across a document that you weren't looking for. And this document was a report written around 1914 about Chinese who worked as interpreters for the Immigration Service. And one of the names just jumped off the page at me. It was an interpreter named Frank Tape. And I recognized the name Tape. Now, Tape is not a Chinese name, so it's very unusual. And we know the name because it was the name of a civil rights lawsuit in the 1880s. It was a California case called Tape v. Hurley, and that was about the exclusion of Chinese from public schools. So I wondered if this Frank Tape was related to that family. So, and that was actually not that hard to establish because you go back and look at the old census manuscripts, and there he was the younger brother of little Mae Ngai Tape, who was the girl in the lawsuit, and here he was 20-some years later as an interpreter. Now, then a little more digging turned up the information that Mamie grew up and married an interpreter who also worked for immigration, and another sibling, Emily, married a court interpreter. So I thought, well, that's really interesting. You have a whole family of interpreters. And the father he had been an occasional interpreter, but really he made his money as an immigrant broker. He started with hauling baggage for the immigrants who arrived at the docks to Chinatown, and that's actually quite lucrative if you can get them. That's usually a monopoly that's done through the steamship companies. And then from there he went into selling bonds to immigrant Chinese who needed bonds to land, and he was also the passenger agent for the Pacific Mail Steamship Company and the Southern Pacific Railroad. So that means he sold tickets to people in Chinatown, and he had a commission on every ticket. So I began to think of this family as a kind of as exemplars of a certain class of brokers in the community who both served the community but also worked for mainstream institutions like banks, railroad companies, the government, the police, what have you. And I found them to be utterly fascinating because first, it was one of the very, very few ways you could actually work outside of the Chinatown economy or the ethnic economy. It was one of the very, very few ways you could actually get a job with an American institution. So it opened a pathway to kind of social knowledge, contacts, and a more rapid acculturation process. But it's a very ambivalent position because you serve two different interests. They're kind of marginal, to both societies. They've got a foot in each. Each side needs them, but neither side really trusts them. So they actually have a lot of power, although they're very marginal. And I argue that people like the Tapes were really the first ethnic Chinese Americans. They're really the first generation to become have a hyphenated identity. They and many people like them learned English, which was the critical skill, right, from missionary schools, either in China or in the United States. And like Mae Ngai Tape, they were the ones who led some important civil rights battles. But on the other hand, they made their careers through enforcing the exclusion regime, right? Their secret to success was the fact that the masses of people were extremely marginal and depended on people like them to get by. And Frank himself became embroiled in some scandals where he was where he was actually tried on criminal charges of corruption and smuggling immigrants. So I found this contrast of, kind of a civil rights activity on the one hand, and yet arguably criminal and or corrupt or at least exploitative activities on the other to be a really fascinating combination. And it, I think, throws into question what we think of as kind of the normative path of immigrant incorporation, which is that we go from exclusion to inclusion, right? We came here, we were oppressed, we were discriminated against, we were excluded, and then gradually, because we worked hard and we studied hard, we became included, right? And here you actually see a much more complicated dynamic where inclusion and exclusion are intertwined and constitute each other, and it, it's kind of a limit case, right, of what's possible, what was possible in